November 19th, 1943. Treasury Islands, Solomon Chain. Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Miyazaki Shigetoshi watched through his field glasses as something impossible emerged from the pre-dawn darkness. American landing ships were driving straight onto the beach, not deploying small boats, not anchoring offshore. The massive steel vessels simply opened their bow doors like metal crocodiles and began vomiting forth an entire civilization. Trucks rolled directly from ship to shore. Bulldozers descended ramps while still warm from their ocean crossing. Within 40 minutes, construction equipment that should have required days to unload was carving roads through coconut groves. Miyazaki had spent 6 months preparing defensive positions based on one fundamental assumption. The Americans would need ports, capture a harbor or fail. Every Japanese commander from Rabaul to Tokyo believed this mathematical certainty. But these landing ships obeyed no rules Miyazaki understood. They carried not just soldiers, but the infrastructure to support them. Each vessel contained enough equipment to transform an empty beach into a forward base, capable of supporting aircraft operations, artillery emplacements, and supply depots that would feed thousands of troops advancing inland. The colonel lowered his field glasses. His carefully prepared plans for defending the island's non-existent ports had just become worthless. What Imperial General Headquarters never imagined was that America had solved the fundamental equation of Pacific warfare, not with better tactics or superior weapons, but with a ship that eliminated the need for ports entirely. The LST, Landing Ship Tank, would prove to be the most strategically consequential vessel of the Pacific War, not because it won battles, but because it made sustained operations possible in places where naval architects insisted sustained operations were impossible. 348 feet of welded steel, 55 feet wide, a flat bottom that could ground on beaches and retract just as easily. These ungainly vessels would transform American logistics from a vulnerability into an overwhelming advantage that Japanese commanders could observe but never replicate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem that created the LST began not in Washington or at shipyards, but in the desperate waters off Dunkirk in May of 1940. British forces evacuating France had abandoned thousands of tons of equipment on the beaches because conventional ships required dock facilities to load heavy vehicles. Tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, the material foundation of mechanized warfare, all left behind because naval architecture had never solved the fundamental problem of moving heavy equipment from shore to ship without cranes and piers. Winston Churchill understood immediately what this failure meant for any future amphibious operations. You cannot invade a fortified coast if your forces must capture a port before landing their heavy equipment. Yet capturing ports required heavy equipment. The equation was circular and potentially fatal. In November 1940, Churchill sent a memo to his military chiefs with characteristic brevity. We must have ships that can land tanks directly on beaches, not small craft, ocean-going vessels. The British began experimenting with converted tankers, adding bow doors and ramps to vessels originally designed to carry Venezuelan oil across Lake Maracaibo. These makeshift conversions participated in Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa during November 1942. They worked, barely, but revealed how far naval architecture would need to evolve to create a purpose-built landing ship. Meanwhile, American naval architects faced their own crisis. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, received intelligence reports in early 1942 that painted a sobering picture. The Japanese had captured ports from Singapore to Rabaul, establishing a defensive perimeter anchored by harbor facilities that would require months of siege warfare to recapture. American war planners calculated they would need to seize approximately 15 major ports to sustain offensive operations across the Pacific. The Japanese knew this too. Every harbor, from the Philippines to the Solomons, bristled with coastal guns, beach obstacles, and infantry positions designed specifically to make port seizure prohibitively expensive. Tarawa would later demonstrate this reality with brutal clarity. capturing a single fortified atoll cost over 3,000 American casualties in 76 hours. At the Navy Bureau of Ships in Washington, a young naval architect named John Niedermeyer received orders in October 1941 that would consume the next 3 years of his life. Design an ocean-going vessel capable of crossing the Atlantic or Pacific with a full load of tanks and vehicles, then landing that cargo directly onto enemy beaches without dock facilities. The vessel must have shallow enough draft to ground on beaches, yet sufficient seaworthiness to survive open ocean transit. Niedermeyer spent 5 days sketching concepts that violated every principle of conventional ship design. Ocean-going vessels required deep draft for stability. Beaching vessels required shallow draft for shore access. These requirements were mutually exclusive according to 2 centuries of naval architecture, unless you abandoned conventional thinking entirely. His solution borrowed from submarine design: install massive ballast tanks along both sides of the hull. At sea, flood the tanks with seawater to increase draft and improve stability. Approaching a landing beach, pump the tanks empty to reduce draft and allow the vessel to drive directly onto shore. The bow would feature massive doors that opened to deploy a ramp, allowing vehicles to drive directly from ship to beach. The design called for a flat-bottomed hull, necessary for beaching but guaranteed to create a miserable ride in open ocean. The vessel would be slow, maximum speed of 12 knots, making it vulnerable to submarine attack during long transits. The broad beam required for carrying tanks would create quick rolling motion that would sicken crews and require careful cargo securing. Niedermeyer submitted his preliminary drawings to the Royal Navy for approval on November 5, 1941. British naval architects studied the design with the skepticism of professionals being asked to approve something that contradicted their entire training. A flat-bottomed ocean-going vessel would pound itself to pieces in heavy seas. The strain of repeated beachings would crack the hull after perhaps a dozen landings. Yet the alternatives were worse. Continue using small landing craft that couldn't cross oceans independently. Accept that every amphibious operation would require capturing ports before landing heavy equipment. The British approved Niedermeyer's design on November 26, 1941. 11 days later, Pearl Harbor transformed the LST from theoretical concept to urgent priority. The first LST rolled down the ways on December 14, 1942, at a shipyard in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Not a coastal city, not a traditional shipbuilding center. Pittsburgh sat on rivers hundreds of miles from the ocean, chosen specifically because its industrial capacity and steel production could be mobilized immediately without competing with destroyer and carrier construction on the coasts. This geographical oddity revealed something fundamental about American industrial planning. The LST wasn't being built as a naval vessel in the traditional sense. It was being mass-produced as a piece of military equipment, constructed in quantities and at speeds that would have seemed impossible to peacetime naval architecture. The so-called cornfield shipyards along the Ohio and Illinois rivers would eventually produce over 1,000 LSTs during the war. Workers who had never seen the ocean built ships that would cross the Pacific. Farmers who knew welding from repairing tractors constructed hulls that would survive submarine attacks and beaching operations under enemy fire. Construction time for an LST fell from 6 months in 1942 to just 2 months by 1945. This acceleration wasn't achieved through cutting corners, but through systematizing production. Each LST consisted of prefabricated sections welded together in sequence, like assembling a massive steel puzzle. The modular construction meant damaged vessels could be repaired rapidly by replacing entire sections rather than attempting complex hull repairs. The LST's cargo capacity exceeded what most naval planners initially believed possible. The tank deck, a cavernous space running the full length of the vessel, could accommodate 20 Sherman tanks, or 40 trucks, or 177 tons of general cargo, arranged in any combination that fit through the bow doors. An upper deck provided additional cargo space accessed by an elevator, or, in later models, a hinged ramp. But the most revolutionary aspect wasn't cargo capacity. It was the speed of unloading. A conventional cargo ship required cranes, stevedores, and typically 24 to 48 hours to discharge a full load at a proper port facility. An LST could drive onto a beach, open its bow doors, and disgorge its entire cargo in less than 2 hours, using a system of trucks pre-loaded on trailers that tractors could haul directly ashore. This time difference wasn't merely convenient, it was strategically decisive. Every hour a ship spent anchored offshore unloading was an hour it remained vulnerable to air attack, submarine torpedo, or shore battery fire. The LST's rapid discharge meant the vessel could beach, unload, retract, and depart before enemy forces could organize effective counterattacks. The first combat deployment revealed both the LST's potential and its limitations. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, employed 237 LSTs to land the 7th Army on beaches that had no port facilities. The vessels performed exactly as designed, driving onto Sicilian shores and unloading tanks and trucks while under sporadic artillery fire. But the flat-bottomed hull created exactly the miserable ride naval architects had predicted. Sailors called them large, slow targets, a sardonic acknowledgement that the LST combined vulnerability with discomfort in roughly equal measure. The quick rolling motion in even moderate seas made everyone aboard seasick. The pounding in heavy weather developed cracks in the deck that required constant welding. More critically, the LST's shallow draft made it impossible to properly ground on some beaches. Coral reefs prevented the vessels from getting close enough to shore to deploy their ramps, requiring improvised pontoon bridges to span the gap between ramp and beach. On other beaches, uneven grounding put tremendous strain on the hull, as one end of the ship rested firmly while the other section flexed with wave action. Navy planners concluded that LSTs were essentially disposable after approximately 10 landing operations. The cumulative structural damage from repeated beachings simply wore the vessels out faster than they could be refurbished. This calculation shaped a remarkable decision. It was more cost-effective to build new LSTs than to strengthen the design or extensively repair used vessels. Worn-out LSTs received second lives as floating warehouses, repair shops, barracks, hospital ships, and even small aircraft carriers fitted with flight decks for reconnaissance planes. This improvisation revealed something essential about American military logistics. When a tool wore out but still had utility, you found new uses rather than discarding it. By mid-1943, LST production had reached industrial scale. Maritime commission shipyards in Oakland and Vancouver joined the cornfield facilities, creating a manufacturing pipeline that would ultimately deliver 1,051 LSTs to the Navy by war's end. This represented more landing ship tonnage than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed in all categories of vessels combined. Japanese naval intelligence tracked these construction numbers with growing alarm, but what they failed to grasp was that LSTs weren't simply troop transports. They were mobile infrastructure that eliminated Japan's fundamental strategic advantage. The defensive perimeter of fortified ports that was supposed to take years for Americans to breach could now be bypassed entirely. The implications crystallized during planning for Operation Galvanic, the assault on Tarawa Atoll in November 1943. American planners knew the island had no port facilities. Conventional naval wisdom suggested this made Tarawa nearly impossible to support logistically after the initial landing. You could put Marines ashore, but sustaining them with ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements would require vulnerable supply lines stretching back to Hawaii. LSTs changed this calculation completely. The vessels could make the 2,300-mile journey from Pearl Harbor directly to Tarawa's beaches, carrying not just the initial assault waves, but the follow-on supplies needed for extended operations. More importantly, LSTs could shuttle continuously between Hawaii and the front, creating a logistics pipeline that functioned without capturing a single port facility. This capability would prove even more decisive in operations further up the Solomon chain. When American forces landed on Bougainville on November 1, 1943, they did so on beaches Japanese commanders had considered strategically irrelevant precisely because they lacked port infrastructure. The Japanese defensive plan assumed Americans would attempt to capture the harbor at Buka Passage or Tonale Harbor, the only locations where conventional naval logistics could function. Instead, LSTs drove straight onto undefended beaches, and began unloading the construction equipment that would transform those beaches into forward operating bases. Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, rolled off LST ramps aboard bulldozers and immediately began carving airstrips from jungle terrain. Within 72 hours of the initial landing, American aircraft were operating from fields that hadn't existed 3 days earlier. This operational tempo stunned Japanese commanders who had calculated that establishing air superiority over Bougainville would take weeks at minimum. Their defensive preparations assumed they would have time to position reinforcements and artillery before American aviation became operational. LSTs had compressed weeks of expected development time into 3 days of actual construction. Lieutenant Colonel Miyazaki watched from his dugout on Bougainville as the Americans repeated this performance across multiple beaches simultaneously. His defensive strategy had assumed Japanese forces would have days, perhaps weeks, to contest American attempts to establish forward airfields. Instead, bulldozers were already grading runway surfaces, while Marines were still clearing Japanese snipers from tree lines 500 yards inland. The strategic implications crystallized with terrible clarity. Every island Japan controlled across the Pacific now became vulnerable to American forces who could arrive with their own infrastructure. The defensive perimeter of fortified ports that was supposed to slow the American advance for years could be bypassed entirely. Islands that lacked harbors, that Japanese planners had dismissed as strategically irrelevant, suddenly became viable targets. What Imperial General Headquarters failed to comprehend was that LSTs weren't simply ships. They were mobile ports, floating docks, and logistics hubs compressed into a single vessel that eliminated Japan's fundamental strategic advantage. The war had become a contest between Japanese defensive preparations and American logistical innovation, and the LSTs ensured that preparation time would never be sufficient. The mathematics of this new reality became apparent during operations throughout late 1943 and early 1944. American forces no longer needed to choose between capturing heavily fortified ports or abandoning operations entirely. Instead, they selected landing sites based on tactical advantage, terrain suitable for airfield construction, and proximity to strategic objectives. Whether those beaches had port facilities became irrelevant. Tarawa demonstrated both the promise and limitations of this new approach. The assault on Betio Island in November 1943 employed LSTs to deliver the 2nd Marine Division and supporting equipment to beaches that had no dock infrastructure whatsoever. 29 LSTs participated in Operation Galvanic, carrying vehicles, ammunition, construction equipment, and supplies needed to sustain operations on an atoll measuring barely 290 acres. The battle itself proved bloody, with over 1,000 Marines killed in 76 hours of fighting against 4,500 Japanese defenders, who had transformed Betio into a fortress of concrete pillboxes and intricate trench systems. But the casualties, horrific as they were, occurred during the assault itself. Once the island was secured, LSTs immediately began the work of transforming Betio from captured territory into operational base. Within 48 hours of the island being declared secure, construction equipment was already improving the existing airfield, while Seabees worked to expand fuel storage capacity and establish ammunition depots. The speed of this transformation stunned Japanese observers monitoring American radio traffic from neighboring atolls. Traditional military doctrine suggested that establishing a functional airbase on a newly captured island required weeks of preparation, shipping heavy equipment from distant ports, and constructing infrastructure from scratch. LSTs compressed this timeline to days. The vessels that had delivered Marines to the assault beaches simply remained offshore, continuing to unload cargo as soon as the immediate combat area was secured. Trucks drove directly from LST ramps onto the beach, then inland to where Seabees were already laying out supply dumps and maintenance facilities. This continuous logistics flow meant American forces never experienced the vulnerable period between capture and fortification that Japanese defenders hoped to exploit with counterattacks. The lesson wasn't lost on Japanese military planners. Reports filtering back to Tokyo from field commanders described American logistics capabilities that seemed physically impossible. How could forces operating thousands of miles from their nearest major base maintain such aggressive operational tempo? How were Americans establishing air superiority over newly captured islands before Japanese reinforcements could even arrive? The answer, though Japanese intelligence officers recognized it, offered no viable countermeasures. America's industrial capacity had created vessels specifically designed to eliminate the logistics bottlenecks that constrained traditional naval campaigns. More critically, American shipyards were producing these vessels faster than Japan could destroy them. By mid-1944, LST production had reached staggering levels. Maritime Commission shipyards in 17 states were delivering completed vessels at a rate exceeding 40 ships per month. This industrial output represented more than mere numbers. Each LST carried the infrastructure needed to support roughly 200 Marines or soldiers, along with their vehicles, equipment, and supplies for sustained operations. The strategic calculation was brutally simple. Japan's defensive strategy assumed that capturing islands would require Americans to first seize ports capable of supporting follow-on operations. LSTs eliminated this assumption. Every beach with reasonably shallow approach gradients and firm sand became a potential landing site. The defensive perimeter Japan had spent 2 years fortifying suddenly had thousands of miles of vulnerable coastline instead of dozens of defendable harbors. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese Vice Admiral Raizo Tanaka, reflecting on the Guadalcanal campaign after the war, stated flatly that Japan's doom had been sealed during the struggle for that single island. What Tanaka understood, what many Japanese commanders came to recognize too late, was that American logistics capability represented a weapon more decisive than any aircraft carrier or battleship. The ability to establish and sustain forward bases faster than Japan could reinforce or counterattack made American island-hopping strategy not merely viable, but virtually unstoppable. The collaboration between LSTs and Seabees created an operational synergy that Japanese forces had no answer for. Construction battalions arriving aboard LSTs brought not just tools and materials, but the organizational structure to transform empty beaches into functional military installations within days. A single Seabee battalion of 1,200 men, equipped with bulldozers, graders, and portable sawmills, could construct a 3,000-foot airstrip in less than a week under combat conditions. This construction speed relied entirely on LSTs delivering the heavy equipment directly to the work site. Traditional cargo ships would have required cranes and stevedores to unload bulldozers, then additional time and equipment to transport those machines to the construction site. LSTs simply drove bulldozers down their ramps directly onto the beach where runways would be built. The elimination of intermediate handling steps accelerated every aspect of base construction. The impact became most visible during the Marianas Campaign in summer 1944. American forces assaulted Saipan, Tinian, and Guam simultaneously, landing on multiple beaches across 3 separate islands. LSTs delivered not only the assault waves but the construction equipment needed to transform each island into a forward air base capable of supporting B-29 bomber operations against the Japanese home islands. Tinian offered the most dramatic example of this logistics revolution. The island measured approximately 12 miles long by 6 miles wide, with terrain suitable for constructing multiple parallel runways capable of handling heavy bombers. But Tinian had no port facilities adequate for supporting major construction operations. Under traditional logistics doctrine, this would have made the island unusable as a bomber base despite its strategic location. LSTs solved this problem with characteristic directness. The vessels beached themselves on Tinian's northwestern shores and began disgorging construction equipment while Marines were still fighting to secure the island's southern end. Within 2 weeks of the initial landing, Seabees had completed the first operational runway. Within 2 months, Tinian possessed 4 parallel runways totaling over 8 miles of concrete, making it the busiest airfield in the world during the final year of the war. Japanese commanders observing this transformation from bypassed islands nearby could only report to Tokyo what they were witnessing. American forces were not merely capturing territory, they were industrializing it, transforming coral, atolls, and jungle-covered volcanic islands into forward operating bases that rivaled facilities in Hawaii or the continental United States. And they were accomplishing this without requiring a single deep-water port. The strategic implications extended beyond simple logistics. LSTs enabled American forces to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions entirely, selecting landing sites based on tactical advantage rather than port availability. This freedom of maneuver forced Japanese defenders to spread their forces across thousands of miles of coastline, never certain where American forces would strike next. Rabaul, Japan's massive fortress complex on New Britain Island, exemplified this strategic obsolescence. Japanese forces had spent 2 years fortifying Rabaul, constructing one of the most heavily defended positions in the Pacific. Over 100,000 troops and extensive naval and air facilities made direct assault on Rabaul prohibitively expensive. Traditional military thinking suggested American forces would either have to capture Rabaul or abandon operations in the South Pacific. LSTs enabled a third option. American forces simply bypassed Rabaul entirely, landing on nearby islands that lacked the extensive fortifications but offered adequate beaches for LST operations. By establishing air bases on these bypassed positions, American forces neutralized Rabaul without ever assaulting it directly. The fortress that had cost Japan enormous resources to construct became strategically irrelevant, its garrison trapped and isolated while American forces continued advancing. This strategy of bypassing, which MacArthur and Nimitz employed across the Pacific, relied entirely on LST's ability to establish logistics support at locations lacking traditional port infrastructure. Japanese defenders concentrated at major harbors found themselves watching American ships sail past to land at beaches Japanese planners had never bothered to fortify. The defensive strategy that was supposed to delay American advances for years collapsed within months. The human cost of this logistics revolution appeared in Japanese casualty figures that told a story of strategic starvation. As many as 60% of Japanese military deaths during the Pacific War resulted from disease and malnutrition rather than combat. American submarine warfare crippled Japanese shipping, but LSTs ensured American forces never experienced similar supply problems. Even on the most remote atolls, American troops received regular resupply of food, ammunition, and medical supplies delivered directly to beaches by vessels designed specifically for that purpose. Japanese logistics, by contrast, collapsed under the strain of operating across vast ocean distances without adequate shipping. Troops defending bypassed islands slowly starved while waiting for reinforcements and supplies that would never arrive. American submarines sank the merchant vessels Japan needed to sustain its garrisons, and Japanese shipbuilding capacity proved wholly inadequate to replace losses. The industrial disparity was staggering. During just the first 4 months of 1943, American shipyards produced more merchant tonnage than Japan constructed in 7 years of wartime production. This overwhelming material advantage wasn't merely about numbers. It reflected fundamental differences in strategic thinking and industrial organization that made American logistics sustainable, while Japanese supply lines gradually strangled. LSTs embodied this industrial advantage in its most visible form. Each vessel represented the synthesis of mass production techniques, innovative design, and strategic foresight that characterized American wartime mobilization. The ships were ugly, slow, and uncomfortable. Sailors joked that LST stood for large, slow target, but these ungainly vessels delivered victory through the unglamorous but essential work of logistics. By late 1944, American forces were operating across the Pacific with a logistics network that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. LSTs shuttled continuously between rear bases and forward positions, creating supply pipelines that functioned without ports. This logistical independence meant American forces could sustain operations indefinitely, while Japanese defenders gradually weakened from lack of supply. The psychological impact on Japanese troops proved as devastating as the material shortages. Soldiers watching American LSTs arrive daily with fresh supplies, while their own rations dwindled to starvation levels, understood viscerally what their commanders in Tokyo refused to accept. This war wasn't being won or lost in decisive naval battles or heroic infantry charges. It was being won through industrial capacity and logistical superiority that Japan simply could not match. The final demonstration of LST dominance came during Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. American planners assembled what historians would later recognize as the largest amphibious force in human history. Over 1,600 ships and 350,000 naval personnel converged on the Ryukyu Islands for an operation that would test every logistics innovation developed during 3 years of Pacific warfare. The assault force included hundreds of LSTs organized into tractor groups that would deliver not just the initial assault waves, but the construction equipment and supplies needed to transform Okinawa into the final staging base for the planned invasion of Japan itself. By April 1, 1945, when American troops came ashore, the LST had evolved from experimental design to the foundation of American amphibious doctrine. The statistics from Okinawa revealed the scale of logistics operations that LSTs made possible. Over 747,000 measurement tons of cargo came ashore during the campaign. Nearly 400,000 measurement tons were unloaded at points other than established ports, delivered directly to beaches by LSTs that grounded themselves repeatedly throughout the 82-day battle. This tonnage included everything needed to sustain over 180,000 combat troops operating under the most difficult conditions. Food, ammunition, construction materials, vehicles, fuel, medical supplies, replacement equipment, all flowing continuously from LSTs that shuttled between Okinawa and rear bases hundreds of miles away. The logistics pipeline never faltered despite Japanese kamikaze attacks that sank or damaged over 200 Allied vessels during the campaign. Japanese defenders on Okinawa fought with savage determination, inflicting over 50,000 American casualties while defending every cave and ridge with fanatic resistance. But they fought knowing that American supply lines would never collapse, that fresh troops and ammunition would continue arriving regardless of how many ships the kamikazes sank. The psychological impact of facing an enemy with essentially unlimited logistics proved as demoralizing as the material shortages Japanese forces endured. By late spring 1945, American commanders were planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan's home islands scheduled for November. The logistics requirements dwarfed anything previously attempted. Millions of troops would need to cross the Pacific, supported by supply lines that would strain even American industrial capacity. Every planning document identified LSTs as the critical component that would make sustained operations on Japanese soil possible. The invasion never occurred. Japan surrendered in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the LSTs that had been positioned for Operation Downfall played their final crucial role in the war's aftermath. American occupation forces arrived in Japan aboard LSTs that landed directly on Japanese beaches, delivering the troops and equipment needed to implement the surrender terms. The vessels that had eliminated Japanese strategic advantages through superior logistics now delivered the peace. LSTs carried occupation troops to ports across Japan, unloading military government personnel, food aid for civilian populations, and construction equipment to begin rebuilding infrastructure destroyed during years of strategic bombing. The ships designed for war proved equally effective in the complex work of occupation and reconstruction. In the years following Japan's surrender, military analysts attempted to quantify the LST's contribution to Allied victory. The numbers told part of the story: 1,051 LSTs delivered during the war, hundreds of thousands of individual beaching operations, millions of tons of cargo transferred directly from ship to shore without port facilities. These statistics captured the scale, but not the strategic significance. The deeper truth emerged from examining Japanese military planning documents captured after the war. Imperial General Headquarters had based its entire defensive strategy on assumptions that American forces would require ports to sustain operations. Every fortified position, every defensive plan, every calculation of how long Japan could hold strategic positions, all rested on the belief that capturing harbors would constrain American offensive operations. LSTs had invalidated these assumptions so completely that Japanese commanders found themselves defending positions that no longer mattered, while American forces established bases at locations Japanese planners had never bothered to fortify. The defensive perimeter that was supposed to delay American advances for years collapsed in months because the fundamental premise underlying Japanese strategy proved obsolete before the first LST even grounded on an enemy beach. The irony was profound. Japan had studied American industrial capacity extensively before Pearl Harbor. Intelligence assessments correctly identified American production advantages in aircraft, ships, and armaments. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was that American industrial innovation would extend beyond weapons to the unglamorous but essential realm of logistics. The LST represented a revolution in military thinking. Traditional naval architecture insisted that ocean-going vessels required deep draft and proper ports. American designers had looked at the problem differently. Instead of asking how to capture ports, they asked how to eliminate the need for ports entirely. The answer proved to be a flat-bottomed ship that violated every principle of conventional design but worked brilliantly for its intended purpose. This pattern of innovation through questioning assumptions characterized American wartime mobilization across multiple domains. When told that conventional wisdom demanded certain limitations, American engineers and planners asked whether those limitations were actually necessary or simply inherited from tradition. Often, challenging the assumption revealed opportunities for revolutionary solutions. The LST's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The design principles established during the war influenced amphibious warfare doctrine for decades. Modern landing ships still employ variations of the bow door and ramp system pioneered by LSTs. The concept of vessels designed specifically to deliver cargo directly to beaches without port infrastructure remains fundamental to military logistics planning, but perhaps the most significant legacy was strategic rather than technical. The LST demonstrated that logistics could be weaponized, that industrial capacity properly applied could provide decisive military advantages even without superior tactics or firepower. Japanese commanders understood how to fight individual battles with skill and determination. What they never comprehended was that America had transformed the fundamental nature of Pacific warfare through innovations that made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Lieutenant Colonel Miyazaki, watching those first LSTs disgorge their cargo on Treasury Island's beaches in November 1943, had witnessed the beginning of Japan's strategic collapse. He couldn't have known it at the time. The vessels looked ungainly, almost comical in their flat-bottomed awkwardness. But what they represented, the ability to turn any beach into a port, any coral atoll into a forward base, proved more decisive than any weapon system Japan faced during the war. The mathematics were inexorable. American industrial capacity produced over 1,000 LSTs during the war. Japanese shipyards managed to construct approximately 700 merchant ships total during the same period, most far smaller than LSTs, and all vulnerable to American submarines that sank over 8 million tons of Japanese shipping. The disparity wasn't merely numerical, it reflected fundamentally different approaches to warfare, logistics, and the application of industrial power. By war's end, LSTs had become so commonplace that soldiers and sailors took them for granted. The vessels that had seemed impossible in 1941, ocean-going ships that could beach themselves and retract just as easily, had become routine. What had been revolutionary innovation became standard operating procedure. This normalization of the extraordinary captured something essential about American industrial achievement during World War II. The flat-bottomed ships that naval architects insisted couldn't survive ocean crossings had sailed across both the Atlantic and Pacific millions of miles collectively. The vessels that were supposed to break apart after a few beaching operations continued functioning through dozens of landings. The logistics revolution that Japanese commanders believed impossible had become the foundation of American victory. Today, LSTs from World War II survive in museums and as memorials, their hulls rusting testimony to innovations born from urgent necessity. Walking their cavernous tank decks, it remains difficult to fully comprehend the strategic revolution these vessels represented. They look like industrial equipment, which in many ways they were, but they functioned as strategic weapons that eliminated Japanese defensive advantages more effectively than any battleship or bomber. The engineers who designed LSTs, the shipyard workers who built them, the sailors who crewed them, few became famous. Their work lacked the dramatic appeal of carrier pilots or marine assaults, but their contribution proved equally essential. American victory in the Pacific rested on the unglamorous foundation of logistics, and LSTs provided the tool that made sustained offensive operations possible across the vast distances that defined Pacific warfare. Japanese commanders never imagined that American landing ships would turn islands into fortresses. They understood American industrial capacity in abstract terms, recognized numerical advantages in production statistics. What they failed to grasp was that American innovation would extend beyond building more ships to designing fundamentally new vessels that changed the strategic equation. This failure of imagination, the inability to conceive that the rules of naval warfare could be rewritten through industrial innovation, cost Japan the war as surely as any battlefield defeat. The LST's story reveals war's essential paradox. Victory often comes not through tactical brilliance or heroic sacrifice, though both matter enormously, but through solving the mundane problems of logistics and supply with innovations that make traditional strategies obsolete. Japanese defenders fought with courage and determination equal to any force in history, but they fought a war their high command had already lost by failing to anticipate how American industrial innovation would eliminate the strategic assumptions underlying Japan's defensive plans. On beaches across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, LSTs proved that concrete could float, that ports were optional, that distance could be conquered through industrial ingenuity rather than tactical genius. The vessels themselves were temporary expedients, designed to last just long enough to win the war, but the strategic revolution they embodied, the transformation of logistics from constraint into weapon, changed military planning permanently. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.